The river was still when they crossed it. That is the detail that stays with you if you read the accounts carefully enough. No great storm, no omen in the sky. The Danube, wide and cold in the early weeks of the year 447 CE, simply received them. 10,000 horses, then 20, then more than any Roman garrison commander on the southern bank had the capacity to count or the time to report. The sentries who saw the crossing from the walls of their small forts knew, in the way that men know things before their minds have formed the words, that what they were watching was not a raid. Raids end. What crossed the Danube in the spring of 447 did not intend to end. It intended to arrive. Welcome to Portraits of the Past, where we explore the lives of those whose legacies continue to echo through time. Attila had consolidated the Hunnic Empire 2 years prior, in the manner of men who understand that power shared is power diminished. The details are sparse, deliberate in their sparseness, and it does not matter. What matters is that by 445 there was one king on the steppe, one hand on the reins of the most formidable mobile military force in the known world. And that king had been watching Constantinople for years with the patience of a man who knows he will not need to hurry. He had reasons. He always had reasons. That was the thing about Attila that his enemies could never quite accept, that there was a mind behind the fire, not merely appetite. The Eastern Roman court under the Emperor Theodosius had fallen behind on tribute. The arrangement was old by now. Gold, in significant annual quantities, paid to the Huns in exchange for the Huns not doing precisely what they were capable of doing. The figure had been renegotiated before, always upward, always on Hunnic terms. But Constantinople had grown complacent or desperate or simply overextended. The Eastern treasury was not bottomless, and the tribute by the 440s had become a source of genuine internal friction. There had been delays. There had been negotiations, the kind of slow diplomatic shuffling that the imperial court had refined over centuries as a substitute for actual military capacity. There had been promises made and unmade and made again. Attila used every breach. Not impulsively. He had not come this far by acting impulsively. He used them as a carpenter uses a crack already in the wood, widening what was there, giving himself language, justification, the appearance of a wronged party responding to provocation. He was not wrong. He was also not waiting for moral clarity. He was waiting for the right moment. The moment came, and Constantinople handed it to him. In late January of 447, before the campaign season had even begun, an earthquake struck the capital. It struck the walls. The Theodosian Walls of Constantinople were the most formidable urban fortifications in the world at that moment. 3 lines of stone, deep and high, built across the peninsula that protected the city on its landward side. They had never been breached. But in the weeks before Attila moved, they cracked. Towers fell. Significant sections of the outer wall collapsed into rubble, while the court was still writing its diplomatic letters explaining the delays in payment. Attila was informed, as such men are always informed, and in the spring he crossed the river. What followed was not a battle in the Roman sense, not two armies meeting on a defined field with the outcome to be determined by courage and discipline and the weight of trained infantry. The Hunnic way of war was older than that, and against a sedentary opponent tied to roads and walls and supply lines, considerably more lethal. Attila's forces moved fast, divided, spread across the Balkan landscape like water finding every channel at once. The first cities fell before messengers could reach the capital to report that the frontier was gone. Marcianopolis, Sardica, Philippopolis. The names appear in the records in a kind of terrible sequence, each one a node in the road network of Roman Thrace, each one now a smoldering gap in the infrastructure of a functioning empire. The Huns did not simply sack and move on, they dismantled. They took the stonework down to a level that made the message unmistakable. This was not plunder. This was demonstration. The Eastern Roman field army, to its credit, came to meet them. The general Arnegisclas was not a timid man. He was one of the more capable commanders the Eastern Empire could field in that decade, which was not a decade kind to capable commanders. He brought his forces to the Utus River, the modern Vit in what is now Bulgaria, and he stood his ground. The battle was fierce. Arnegisclas himself fought, by the accounts, with the kind of personal courage that Roman commanders were expected to display and that occasionally, in better circumstances, carried the day. He died at the Utus. His army was broken, not through cowardice, not through incompetence. The distinction matters, and the Romans who wrote about it later understood that it mattered. They were outmatched. The Hunnic combination of archery, mobility, and sheer tactical aggression could not be countered by an infantry force defending fixed positions against an enemy that refused to engage on those terms. Arnegisclas understood this, probably somewhere in the last hour. He fought anyway. That is worth noting. With the field army gone, there was nothing between the Huns and the interior. 70. That is the number that appears in the sources. 70 cities and fortresses taken or destroyed in the course of this campaign. 70. Let that land without ornamentation. The Roman Balkans had been, before 447, a functioning region of the empire. Roads maintained, trade moving, urban life continuing in the modest but real way that Roman provincial organization made possible. After 447, significant portions of it ceased to function in any meaningful sense. The landscape Attila moved through on the way home was not the landscape he had moved through on the way in. Nisus, the birthplace of Constantine no less, had already been reduced in an earlier campaign. When a Roman diplomat passed through it some years later, he noted that the banks of the river that ran beside the city were thick with bones, not cleared, not buried, simply present in the water and along the margins, as if the ground itself had not yet decided what to do with what had happened there. The details of this devastation survive largely through Priscus, a minor diplomat attached to an embassy sent to Attila's camp in 449. His accounts provide the closest existing portrait of the Hunnic court, an archive that will be examined in due course. The campaign extended further than Rome had anticipated or feared. Hunnic columns pushed south as far as Thermopylae, where a force drove into the Greek peninsula itself, as if reminding the world that even legendary ground was not beyond reach. The Eastern Empire had no answer for it. The field army was gone, the frontier was ash, and the capital itself, its walls only recently shattered by the earth, sat exposed. What happened next was Roman at its best. The prefect of the city mobilized the circus factions, the Blues, the Greens, those great rival organizations of Constantinople's urban life that spent most of their energy on chariot racing and most of their violence on each other, and set them to work rebuilding the walls. 60 days. In 60 days, the walls were repaired. The towers rose again. The mortar was still damp when the scouts reported the Hunnic vanguard on the horizon. The walls held. That is not a small sentence. Had the repairs come slower, had the earthquake done its full work, and the Huns arrived before the stone was reset, the history of the 5th century, possibly of the following millennium, would have been written differently. Constantinople did not fall in 447 because of 60 days of desperate labor and the precise timing of an army that, for whatever reason, did not press its advantage at that specific moment. History's hinges are sometimes that narrow. What Attila got instead was the treaty. It bears the name of the Eastern Roman general Anatolius, who negotiated it, which is the kind of courtesy history extends to men required to do humiliating work. The terms were these. The annual tribute would triple from 700 pounds of gold to 2,100. A lump sum indemnity of 6,000 pounds of gold would be paid for the arrears already owed. A buffer zone along the Danube, 5 days march wide, would be cleared of Roman settlement and ceded, in practical terms, to Hunnic authority. Rome would return any Hunnic fugitives who had fled to Roman territory. The Eastern Empire did not negotiate these terms from a position of strength. It paid them to be left alone. The Huns withdrew north, across the Danube, back into the steppe. The treaty was signed. The gold moved. The diplomats wrote their reports in language carefully calibrated to make the settlement sound like statesmanship rather than tribute. And Attila, in his camp beyond the river, received what was owed him and looked west. The Balkans had been his proof, his demonstration, a message written in the rubble of 70 cities to any court in the known world that wished to understand the new architecture of power. Constantinople had heard the message. It had paid to acknowledge receipt. There were other courts that had not yet heard it. There were fields in Gaul still unburned. There was a Western Empire, older and weaker and fracturing along lines that a careful eye could follow like fault lines in stone. He had time. He had patience. He had an army that had just proven against the best the Eastern world could offer that there was no wall it could not outlast and no field army it could not destroy. The tribute was paid. The treaty was signed. The scourge of God returned to the steppe. He was not finished. He was only looking further. The paint is dry on this chapter, but the archives are vast. Subscribe and return to portraits of the past. The next exhibit awaits.